An unexpected baby shows up at the door of an empire built on coldness and control. A determined woman arrives with buried truths and a deathbed promise. Secrets, deals, and legacies collide in a story where love challenges pride. But when the heart speaks louder, the past returns with a devastating secret. Before you dive into this inspiring story, make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable tales. In the silent mansion of an arrogant tycoon, control was absolute, until the day an unknown woman appeared at the door with a baby in her arms. With steady eyes and a determined voice, she uttered words that would echo forever. "He's your son. My sister, his mother, died." Richard Mitchell took a deep breath, feeling as if the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. He stared at the woman before him, young with dark hair and defiant eyes, and then at the small bundle in her arms. The baby was no more than a few months old. "I think you've made a mistake," he said, maintaining the rigid posture that had made him famous in business circles. "I suggest you look for this child's real father." "There's no mistake," the woman retorted, extending a folder with documents. "My name is Lucy Carter. My sister Hannah was this boy's mother, and you, Mr. Richard Mitchell, are the father." 1. Of the mansion's security guards discreetly approached, waiting for orders to remove the unwanted visitor. Richard, however, raised his hand in a restrained gesture, signaling him to wait. There was something about this woman's conviction that deeply troubled him. "Hannah Carter," he repeated, trying to associate the name with some memory. "I don't know any Hannah." "You met her approximately a year and a half ago in Newport Beach. During the inauguration of your resort, she worked on the public relations team that organized the event." Lucy didn't avert her gaze. "You maintained a discreet relationship for almost 3 months, until you simply disappeared from her life." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Hannah Carter, the young woman with the shy smile and penetrating gaze, the brief romance he ended when his public life began to demand an image more suitable for investors. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, trying to maintain his composure. "And it doesn't prove anything. My sister never tried to find you. She was too proud for that," Lucy continued. "When she discovered the pregnancy, she decided to raise the child alone. She would never have come here if it weren't for—" Her voice faltered momentarily. "If it weren't for the accident that took her away 2 weeks ago." Richard tried to process the information while observing the woman before him. Lucy Carter seemed exhausted, with deep, dark circles marking her young face. She held the baby as if he were the most precious thing in the world, and her eyes, despite their firmness, revealed the pain of a recent loss. "I'm sorry about your sister," said Richard, his cold tone contradicting his words. "But that doesn't mean this baby is mine." "Anyone can show up with a story like this hoping for a financial settlement." Lucy laughed, a harsh sound laden with irony. "If you think I'm here for money, you're very mistaken. I'm here because it was my sister's last wish, for her son to know his father." Before Richard could respond, a female voice sounded from inside the mansion. "Darling, who's at the door? We're late for the cocktail party." Diana Vanderbilt, Richard's fiancée, appeared in the entrance hall wearing an impeccable black dress and discreet jewelry that cost a small fortune. Her eyes quickly scanned Lucy, from her simple clothes to the baby in her arms, with that kind of assessment that dispensed with words. "Who is this person?" she asked, positioning herself beside Richard and possessively linking her arm with his. "No one important," he answered, but Lucy was quicker. "I'm Lucy Carter, and this is Michael, your fiancé's son, with my deceased sister." Diana paled for a moment, but quickly regained her composure, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Richard, darling, why don't we resolve this on Monday? Your lawyer can handle this misunderstanding. We're pressed for time with the Japanese investor's reception." But Lucy was already opening the folder she'd brought, first removing a birth certificate with Richard's name listed as the father, and then something that made the businessman freeze, a gold wristwatch with the initials RM engraved on the back. "You gave this to my sister after your first month together," said Lucy, extending the watch. "She kept it as a memento even after you disappeared." Richard took the object, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. It was his. a gift he'd received from his father when he turned 21. He vaguely remembered giving it to Hannah one night as they walked along the beach. "This proves nothing," declared Diana, her voice now laden with impatience. "A watch can be bought, stolen. Anyone can obtain an object like this." "Of course," Lucy responded with a sad smile. "That's why I also brought these." She handed Richard an envelope. Inside was a sequence of photographs, him and Hannah in intimate moments at the resort, walking on the beach, dining at a discreet restaurant, and a last one, showing Hannah visibly pregnant, looking at the camera with a serene smile, wearing the gold watch on her wrist. "My sister never wanted anything from you," Lucy continued, "but when she realized she wouldn't survive the accident, she made me promise to bring Michael to meet his father. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking you to assume a role you never wanted. I'm just fulfilling a promise." At that moment, the baby stirred in Lucy's arms, opening his eyes and staring at the adults around him. Richard felt as if he'd received an electric shock. The boy's eyes were exactly like his, a peculiar shade of greenish-brown that he'd inherited from his father. "Richard, we don't have time for this," insisted Diana, pulling on her fiancé's arm. "Your lawyer can resolve everything on Monday." But Richard couldn't look away from the baby. "How old is he?" 4 months, Lucy answered. "He was born on January 15th. April, May, June, July, Richard calculated mentally. If he had been conceived in April of the previous year, the timeline matched perfectly with the period he had been with Hannah. "Come in," he said suddenly, opening the door wider. "Let's talk inside." Diana held him by the arm. "Richard, the Japanese are waiting. This is the biggest deal of the year. You can't jeopardize everything because of an unproven story." For the first time, Richard looked directly into his fiancée's eyes. "Schedule another meeting. Say I had a family emergency." "Family emergency?" Diana repeated, almost spitting the words. "This woman appears out of nowhere with a child, and you already consider her family?" "Diana," Richard's voice acquired an icy tone that everyone in his companies knew well. "Schedule another meeting." Turning on her heels, Diana disappeared into the house, the sound of her high heels echoing furiously across the marble floor. "Josh," Richard called, addressing the security guard, "bring coffee for Miss Carter, and ask Martha to prepare the ground floor guest room." Lucy entered the mansion with hesitant steps, still holding Michael firmly against her chest. The grandeur of the place, with its crystal chandeliers, artwork, and imported furniture, dramatically contrasted with the simple apartment where she and Hannah had grown up. "I don't intend to impose my presence," she said when they were alone in the spacious living room. "I just wanted you to know about Michael, for him to at least know his father's face, even if from a distance." Richard served himself a whiskey, drinking half the glass in a single gulp. "I'll do a DNA test," he finally declared. "If it proves I'm the father, I'll assume my legal responsibilities." I didn't come after money," Lucy repeated, irritation beginning to show in her voice. "Michael has a modest inheritance left by Hannah, and I have my job as a teacher. We don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" asked Richard, looking directly at her. "I wanted you to know. I wanted to honor my sister's last wish," Lucy hesitated before adding, "and I wanted Michael not to grow up thinking he was abandoned, that his father simply never cared to meet him." The silence that followed was interrupted by the baby's cry. Lucy adjusted him in her arms, murmuring words of comfort while trying to calm him. "He's hungry," she explained. "May I use your kitchen to prepare his bottle?" Richard nodded, indicating the way. He followed them to the enormous stainless steel kitchen, rarely used by himself. He observed in silence as Lucy, with surprising efficiency for someone holding a baby, prepared the "Bless him, how long have you been caring for him?" Richard finally asked. "Since the accident. 2 weeks and 3 days. Lucy tested the milk's temperature on the back of her hand. "But I've always been present in his life. Hannah and I lived together." As she fed the baby, Richard noticed other details, the shape of Michael's face so similar to his own as a child, the way the small forehead furrowed in concentration while feeding, the almost imperceptible birthmark near his ear, identical to the one Richard carried. "Where are your things?" he asked abruptly. Lucy looked up, confused. In the car. One bag of mine and another with Michael's things. Why? Josh will get them. You'll stay here until we resolve this situation. That's not necessary. We can stay at a hotel. I only came. So you could meet him, not to... You're staying, Richard interrupted in a tone that allowed no discussion. If this is really my son, I want to understand all the circumstances, and if not, he made a significant pause. I also want to know why you're trying to involve me in this story. Lucy took a deep breath, trying to control her growing irritation. Look, I understand your suspicion, but I didn't come here to create problems. If you prefer we stay somewhere else... I've already said you're staying, Richard cut her off again. Until we have the DNA test results. After that, we'll decide the next steps. The sound of heels in the hallway announced Diana's return. She entered the kitchen wearing a light leather coat, her purse tightly gripped like a weapon. I resolved the problem with the Japanese, she announced, completely ignoring Lucy and the baby. They're expecting us tomorrow for brunch. I hope by then you'll have resolved this situation. Her eyes finally slid to the young woman. I assume the lady is already leaving. Richard intervened before Lucy could respond. She and the child will stay here for a few days. Diana's perfectly made-up face contorted in an expression of disbelief. You can't be serious. When she saw that Richard wasn't backing down, she changed tactics, softening her voice. Darling, I know you're confused, but you can't simply shelter strangers in our home based on an unproven story. What if it's some kind of scam? We'll do the test on Monday, Richard replied. In the meantime, they'll stay in the guest room. It's a matter of responsibility. Responsibility? Diana let out a sharp laugh. You don't even know if this baby is yours. At that moment, Michael finished feeding, and Lucy lifted him to burp him. The simple, natural gesture made Richard observe them more attentively. There was a quiet dignity in that woman, something that contrasted with Diana's manufactured drama. It's a decision that's been made, declared Richard, ending the discussion. Turning to Lucy, he continued, Martha will show you to your room. If you need anything for the baby, just ask. Diana left the kitchen without another word, but the tension she left behind was almost palpable. Lucy adjusted Michael in her arms and looked at Richard with a mixture of gratitude and distrust. Thank you for the hospitality, but I need to make one thing clear. I'm not after your money or your name. I only came to honor my sister's wish. Richard nodded, watching as a maid entered the kitchen to escort Lucy to her room. When he was alone, he poured himself another whiskey and walked to the window overlooking the immaculately maintained garden. His meticulously planned life was beginning to crumble. In a few months, he would marry Diana, daughter of one of the country's biggest businessmen, a union that would consolidate his corporate empire. They would have children at the appropriate time, children who would grow up with all the advantages money could buy. Now, an unknown woman arrived with a baby in her arms, threatening to destroy everything, if Michael were really his son. Richard closed his eyes, remembering Hannah. The brief relationship they maintained had been intense, something he hadn't expected, and that ended abruptly when the reality of his social obligations imposed itself. He never imagined those moments would have such lasting consequences. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Diana. We need to talk. Now. Richard set the device aside without responding. For the first time in years, he felt completely lost. The perfect order of his life had been interrupted, and he didn't know how or if he wanted to restore it. The next morning, Richard awoke to a sound that had never before echoed in that house, a baby's cry. For a moment he was disoriented, until the memories of the previous day returned like an avalanche. He dressed quickly and descended the stairs, finding Lucy in the living room, pacing back and forth while trying to calm Michael. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept all night. Is he sick? Asked Richard, approaching hesitantly. Lucy shook her head. He's just not used to the environment. Children this age are very sensitive to changes. Without thinking much about what he was doing, Richard extended his arms. May I? Lucy's surprised gaze met his. but she slowly transferred the baby to the businessman's arms. Michael stopped crying almost instantly, staring curiously at the unfamiliar face observing him. For a brief moment, father and son looked at each other in silence. And in that instant, even before any DNA test, Richard knew the truth that would change his life forever. Lucy and Michael's presence completely transformed the routine of the mansion in the days that followed. What was once an environment of almost sepulchral silence, interrupted only by the occasional tinkling of crystal glasses and formal conversations, now echoed with baby cries, soft voices humming lullabies, and the clinking of bottles being prepared. In the early hours, Richard, always so methodical and controlling, now found himself immersed in a reality for which his MBAs and leadership courses hadn't prepared him. In executive meetings, he found himself thinking about little Michael, and his nights, previously dedicated to reviewing contracts, were interrupted by silent visits to the room where the baby slept. On Monday, as planned, a discreet and absolutely trusted doctor came to the mansion to collect samples for the DNA test. Diana made a point of being present throughout the procedure, observing with eagle eyes as the professional explained the process and assured that the results would be confidential. "How long until we know the result?" she asked, barely disguising her anxiety. "Between 3 to 5 business days," replied the doctor, carefully storing the samples. "We'll do it as quickly as possible, Mr. Mitchell." Richard merely nodded, his gaze fixed on Michael, who was playing contentedly in Lucy's lap. It was strange how, with each passing hour, he could identify more familiar traits in that small being. The shape of the eyes, identical to his, the way he furrowed his brow when concentrating, a gesture his mother had always pointed out in him since childhood. When the doctor left, an uncomfortable silence took over the room. Diana was the first to break it. "Well, now we just have to wait," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In the meantime, perhaps we should return to our routines. Richard, you have the board meeting at 2, and I promised my mother I'd visit the florists to decide on the wedding arrangements." Lucy stood up, adjusting Michael in her arms. "We don't want to get in the way. We can stay in the room or take a walk in the garden." "No," Richard said suddenly. "You're not in the way. This house is too big for us to need to hide from each other." Diana gave him an icy look. "Darling, don't you think you're being a bit hasty? We don't even have the results yet." "Hasty would be ignoring the possibility until we have absolute certainty," he replied, maintaining a calculatedly neutral tone. "Go to your meeting with the florists. I'll be in the office preparing the presentation for the board." When Diana left, stepping harder than necessary, Richard turned to Lucy. "I apologize for her behavior. This situation is unusual for all of us." "No need to apologize," Lucy replied. "I completely understand. If I were in her place, I probably wouldn't react much better." There was a disconcerting sincerity in that woman. Unlike the people who normally circulated in his social milieu, always calculating each word, each gesture, Lucy seemed genuinely transparent. It was refreshing and, at the same time, deeply disturbing for someone accustomed to deciphering hidden agendas. "You and your sister are very different," commented Richard, in a rare moment of vulnerability. "Yes and no," Lucy replied with a slight smile. "Hannah was more delicate, more of a dreamer. I've always been the practical one, the problem solver. But deep down we shared the same values." "What values?" "Honesty, loyalty, the belief that people are more important than possessions." She adjusted Michael in her arms. "Hannah admired your determination, you know. She said you had old scars, hidden beneath that impeccable suit." The observation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Few people managed to see beyond the facade he had so carefully constructed over the years. Hannah, apparently, had been one of them. "Your sister had a fertile imagination," he deflected, checking his watch. "I need to go to the office now. Feel free to use any common area of the house. Martha will be available if you need anything." As the days passed, the initial strangeness was replaced by an unlikely routine. In the morning, Richard often had breakfast with Lucy and Michael, before going to the office. At night, after long workdays, he found himself seeking their company, if only to observe the baby being bathed or falling asleep to the sound of lullabies. Diana tried to disguise her growing irritation, but the signs were everywhere. The acidic comments about the temporary guest, the constant calls during the day to check if Richard had already returned home, the insistence on discussing wedding preparations, always in Lucy's presence, Wednesday night, as Lucy was putting Michael to bed, Richard received a call from the doctor. "The results are ready, Mr. Mitchell," announced the voice on the other end of the line. "I'd like you to come to the laboratory tomorrow to discuss them personally." "That's not necessary," replied Richard, his voice firm. "You can tell me now." There was a brief pause, followed by the confirmation that deep down he already expected. The test came back positive. The probability of paternity is greater than 99.9%. The boy is, without a doubt, your biological son. Even prepared for this possibility, Richard felt the impact of the confirmation. A mixture of relief and terror ran through his body as he absorbed the undeniable truth. He was a father of a 4-month-old baby with a woman who was no longer among the living. "Thank you, doctor," he managed to say before hanging up. He sat in his office for almost an hour, reflecting on the implications of that news. Michael was his son. What did that mean now? What would be the next step? When he finally gathered the courage to leave the office, he found Diana waiting in the hallway, arms crossed and a tense expression. "It was the laboratory, wasn't it?" she asked without preamble. Richard nodded. "The test came back positive. Michael is my son." Diana closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the information. When she reopened them, there was a calculating determination in her gaze. "All right," she said, surprising Richard. "We can resolve this. You have resources, excellent lawyers. We can offer the young woman a generous settlement, a house, perhaps a fund for the boy's education. She returns to her life, you fulfill your financial obligations, and we proceed with our plans." The coldness with which she presented that proposal left Richard momentarily speechless. Diana was talking about his son, as if he were merely an inconvenience to be managed, an item on an expense spreadsheet. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "Of course it is," insisted Diana, her voice gaining an urgent tone. "Richard, be rational. You barely know this woman. The baby is 4 months old. He doesn't even form memories yet. She wasn't expecting anything from you until now, so any offer will be seen as generosity. He's my son, Diana." "So what?" Her mask of civility was beginning to crack. "Many men have children outside of marriage. They pay child support, visit occasionally, send presents at Christmas. They don't need to upend their entire lives because of it." "Michael isn't it," replied Richard, feeling a wave of protectiveness he never imagined himself capable of feeling. "And I'm not many men." At that moment, Lucy appeared in the hallway, clearly uncomfortable for having interrupted the discussion. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, beginning to step away. "I just came to get a glass of water." "No." "Stay," Richard requested. "Actually, we need to talk. The test results have arrived." Lucy stopped, her body visibly tense. "And?" "The test confirmed it. Michael is my son." The news, although expected, made Lucy release a trembling sigh. "I knew it. Hannah would never lie about something like this." "Great, now that we all know the truth," Diana interjected with false animation, "we can discuss the terms of the agreement." "What agreement?" asked Lucy, furrowing her brow. "The financial agreement, dear," explained Diana with condescension. "Richard, as the honorable man he is, wishes to assume his responsibilities toward the child. We're thinking of a substantial educational fund, perhaps a house where you can live comfortably." "I'm not interested in financial agreements," interrupted Lucy, her tone surprisingly firm. "As I've already said, I didn't come after money. Michael has the right to know his father. That was Hannah's wish." "And what exactly do you expect?" questioned Diana, abandoning any pretense of cordiality. "That Richard will abandon his life, his work, his commitments to play daddy? He's the CEO of a multinational. He's about to get married. He can't simply—" "Diana, enough." Richard's voice, though low, carried an undeniable authority. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Finally, Diana adjusted her impeccable blazer, forcing a smile that didn't disguise her fury. "You're right, darling. We'll discuss this privately, like the civilized adults we are." Turning to Lucy, she added, "I'm sure the lady understands that there are issues here that go far beyond the romantic wishes of a deceased sister." With that, she spun on her heels and disappeared down the hallway, leaving a heavy silence behind. "I'm sorry about that," said Richard after a few moments. "Diana can be intense when she feels threatened." "No need to apologize," replied Lucy, tired. "I understand perfectly. Actually, I should apologize for causing so much disruption in your life." "You haven't caused any disruption, you just revealed a truth I was unaware of." Richard ran his hand through his hair, a rare gesture that betrayed his emotional state. "Michael is my son. That changes everything." "What do you intend to do now?" asked Lucy, her voice almost a whisper. "Honestly? I don't know," Richard offered, a sad smile. "It was never in my plans to become a father like this suddenly, but it was also never in my plans to ignore my own flesh and blood." "Michael doesn't need to interfere with your plans," said Lucy softly. "We can find an arrangement that works for everyone. Regular visits, perhaps. The important thing is that he knows he has a father who cares." There was something in the simplicity of that proposal, in the total absence of demands or manipulations, that deeply touched Richard. In his world, people rarely asked for so little. "We'll figure this out," he promised, "step by step. But for now, I'd like both of you to continue staying here. If that's okay with you, of course." Lucy hesitated. "Are you sure? After your fiancé's reaction?" "This is also my home," affirmed Richard with a conviction surprising even to himself. "And Michael is my son. You're welcome for as long as necessary." That night, while Lucy fell asleep in the guest room with Michael by her side, Richard faced the worst argument of his relationship. With Diana. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she shouted, pacing back and forth in the main suite. "First, you allow this woman and this child to stay in our home, and now, even after confirming paternity, you invite them to stay indefinitely. What's next, Richard? Will you suggest we form a modern, happy family all living together?" "I'm just trying to be responsible," Richard defended himself, keeping his voice low so as not to be heard by the other occupants of the house. "Michael is my son. I can't simply ignore that." "No one is suggesting you ignore it." Diana stopped her frantic pacing to face him. "But there are adult, civilized ways to handle this. Child support, scheduled visits, birthday presents. You don't need to bring your bastard son and his aunt to live with us." The term bastard made Richard feel a rage he rarely experienced. "Never refer to my son that way again." The intensity of his reaction made Diana physically recoil. For a moment, she seemed genuinely surprised before reassuming her combative posture. "This situation is clearly affecting your judgment," she said, changing tactics. "I understand it's a shock, that you're confused and trying to do the right thing, so I'll be patient. But I need you to understand my position too, Richard. In 3 months we'll be married. What will our guests say if they know you have a child from another relationship? What will my father think?" "Your father's opinion about my personal life is irrelevant," Richard responded dryly. "Irrelevant?" Diana let out a bitter laugh. "The merger between our companies directly depends on his goodwill. Or have you forgotten that too?" A heavy silence fell between them. It was true. The marriage to Diana wasn't just a personal union. It was also the consolidation of a business alliance that had been negotiated for years. Charles Vanderbilt, Diana's father and owner of the country's largest media conglomerate, wasn't known for his tolerance of personal scandals. "I haven't forgotten anything," Richard finally said. "But there's more at stake here than business." "Is there really?" Diana's tone was almost mocking. "Since when does Richard Mitchell put anything above business? The man who works 18 hours a day, who never takes vacations, who cancelled our weekend in Paris because an acquisition opportunity arose in Asia. That man is now telling me there are things more important than business?" The cruelty of that observation lay in its precision. For years, Richard had prioritized his company above all else. Relationships, health, leisure, nothing mattered. more than the relentless growth of his empire. But now, strangely, that certainty was beginning to crack. When he looked at Michael, something different stirred inside him, a primitive and powerful emotion he couldn't name, much less control. "I need time," he finally said. "Time to process all of this, to understand what's the best path forward." Diana stared at him for a long moment, her eyes calculating, evaluating. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened. "I understand, darling," she said, approaching to touch his face. "It's a difficult, unexpected situation. You're trying to do the right thing, and that's admirable. I just ask that you also think about us, about the future we plan together." The sudden retreat to a more conciliatory posture left Richard suspicious. He knew Diana too well to believe in easy surrenders. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight," he announced, moving away from her touch. "We both need space to think." The next morning, Richard awoke to unusual sounds coming from the kitchen. Following the voices and the aroma of fresh coffee, he found a surprising scene. Lucy was preparing breakfast while speaking softly to Michael, who watched everything from his little chair. "Good morning," he greeted, hesitant. Lucy turned, visibly embarrassed. "Sorry if we're disturbing. Michael woke up early and I didn't want to bother anyone, so—" "Don't worry," Richard interrupted, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. "It's nice to have movement in the house in the morning." It was true. The enormous mansion, normally silent and formal like a museum, came to life with the presence of these two strangers who, ironically, were now his closest biological family. He approached Michael, observing with fascination how the baby firmly held a small plastic spoon, trying to bring it to his mouth. "He's beginning to want to hold things on his own," Lucy explained, noticing his interest. "Soon he'll be trying to crawl. Hannah used to say he's determined like—" She stopped abruptly, biting her lip. "Like me?" Richard completed, feeling a strange pride. "Yes." At that, a moment, something unprecedented happened. Michael smiled at him, a toothless, bright and genuine smile that illuminated his small face and, somehow inexplicably, warmed something inside Richard that had long remained cold. "He's never smiled at me that quickly," Lucy commented, surprised. "He's usually quite wary of strangers." "Maybe he knows," replied Richard, suddenly feeling vulnerable. "Maybe something in him recognizes something in me." The moment was interrupted by Diana's arrival, impeccably dressed and made up, despite the early hour. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted with false cheer. "What an adorable scene, almost like a real family." The comment, laden with irony, made Lucy visibly withdraw. She quickly began to clean up the small mess she had made. "You don't need to bother with that," said Richard. "We have staff to clean the kitchen." "I prefer to leave everything as I found it," Lucy replied, her pride evident. "That's how I was raised." Diana observed the interaction with calculating eyes. Then, in a surprising move, she approached Michael and smiled at the baby. "He really is a cutie," she commented, extending a perfectly manicured finger for the baby to grasp. "He has your eyes, Richard." The sudden change in attitude left both Richard and Lucy suspicious. "I was thinking," continued Diana, serving herself coffee, "that we could help Lucy get properly established. Perhaps one of the smaller houses in Lakeview Estates? It's a safe place with great schools nearby. Michael would have all possible comfort, and you could visit him whenever you wanted." Lakeview Estates was one of the most exclusive communities in the city, and coincidentally a development of the Vanderbilt family. The proposal, though seemingly generous, had clear objectives: to distance Lucy and Michael from the mansion, keep them under control, and still give Richard the sense of doing the right thing. "That's very kind of you, Diana," Lucy calmly replied. "But as I've said before, I'm not after material possessions. I have my own apartment and my job as a teacher." "A suburban apartment and a teacher's salary will hardly provide Michael with the lifestyle he's entitled to as Richard Mitchell's son," argued Diana, without abandoning her artificial smile. "Think about his welfare, dear." The dear sounded so condescending that Lucy blushed slightly. Richard, noticing the discomfort, intervened. "I think these are decisions that Lucy and I need to make together, calmly. For now, the most important thing is to ensure that Michael is well and safe." Of course," Diana quickly agreed. I'm just offering options. After all, we all want what's best for the little one, don't we? The rest of breakfast proceeded in poorly disguised tension through trivial conversations. When Diana finally withdrew to take a call, Richard turned to Lucy. I'm sorry about that. She's trying to process all of this in her own way. I completely understand, replied Lucy, rising to clean Michael's high chair. And she's not entirely wrong, you know. At some point, we'll need to define what Michael's relationship with you will be like going forward. There was a practicality in Lucy that Richard was beginning to deeply admire. No emotional games, no veiled manipulations, just a refreshing clarity about the situation. Do you have any suggestions? He asked. Lucy thought for a moment. I believe Michael needs stability. A consistent routine, constant people in his life. If you truly wish to participate as a father, you'll need to be present regularly, not just financially, but emotionally. And you, what do you want? The question seemed to take her by surprise. Me? Yes, you. Since you arrived here, you've only talked about what Hannah wanted, about what's best for Michael. But what about you, Lucy? What do you want for your own life? She looked at him with a complex expression, surprise mixed with something he couldn't completely decipher. I want to honor the promise I made to my sister, she finally replied. I want to raise Michael with love and security. I want to see him grow up knowing who his father is, even if you can't be as present as we would like. There was a resignation in her voice that touched something deep in Richard. For the first time, he wondered what it must be like for her to suddenly assume responsibility for a child after losing the only family she had, without asking for anything in return, without demanding recognition or rewards. And your career? Your own dreams? Lucy smiled slightly. I always wanted to be a teacher, to work with special children, to make a difference in their lives. I secured a position at a public school 2 years ago, and I love what I do. Of course, with Michael now, I'll have to reorganize some things, but... Are you on leave? Yes, I took bereavement leave. I return to work next week. I found a daycare near home that seems good. Although, she hesitated, although it's difficult to leave him with strangers when he's so young. Richard absorbed that information slowly. In his world of board meetings and high-level negotiations, he rarely considered the practical realities of ordinary people, daycares, leaves of absence, reorganizing life to accommodate a child. What if, he began, cautious, what if you didn't need to return so soon? What if you could stay with Michael for some more time until he's a little older? Lucy frowned. I can't afford the luxury of not working, Richard. I have bills to pay, and what Hannah left, although it helps, doesn't last forever. I could help, he offered immediately. It's the least I can do as Michael's father. I don't want your charity, she replied, the pride evident in her voice. I didn't come here for that. It's not charity, Lucy. It's responsibility. Richard moved closer, looking directly into her eyes. Michael is my son. I have the legal and moral duty to provide for him, and by extension for you who is caring for him. Something in the sincerity of those words seemed to reach her. Lucy took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. I'm afraid, she finally admitted, afraid of becoming financially dependent on you, and then having Michael taken away from me by some expensive lawyer who argues that you can offer a better life. The vulnerability of that admission surprised Richard. It was a legitimate fear, something that he, with his resources and connections, could theoretically do if he wanted. That would never happen, he assured, with a firmness that surprised him. You're the only mother Michael knows now, the person who comforts him when he cries, who knows his needs. No judge in the world would take a 4-month-old child from the arms of the person who has raised him since birth. Even if that person were a public school teacher against one of the richest businessmen in the country. The skepticism in her voice was palpable. Even then, Richard took her hands in his, a surprisingly intimate gesture. Lucy, I give you my word. I'm not trying to replace you in Michael's life. I just want to be a part of it, of his life and by extension yours." Their gazes met, and for a brief moment something indefinable passed between them. A kind of silent understanding, a truce amidst the chaos their lives had become. The moment was interrupted by Michael's cry, who was beginning to get restless in his chair. Lucy immediately turned to the baby, taking him in her arms with the ease of someone who already knew every nuance of that small creature. Richard observed as she calmed Michael with soft words and gentle touches. And in that instant, he knew his life would never be the same. Not just because he discovered he was a father, but because that woman and that child were rewriting everything he thought he knew about family, responsibility, and perhaps even about love. "About what really happened?" repeated Lucy, confused. Noticing Richard's somber expression, she placed the bottle on the table. "What are you talking about?" Richard slid the folder of documents across the kitchen counter. "Diana had you investigated. She found disturbing things." Lucy opened the folder with trembling hands. As she read the reports, the color drained from her face. "She investigated me? As if I were some kind of criminal?" "Is this true?" insisted Richard, pointing to a specific document. "Were you really hospitalized twice for psychiatric problems?" "Yes," answered Lucy, raising her gaze with surprising dignity. "After our parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, I developed severe depression. I was hospitalized for my own safety." She closed the folder forcefully. "It's not a secret nor a shame. I sought help when I needed it." The sincerity of her response made Richard hesitate, but Diana's insinuations still echoed in his mind. "What about Hannah's accident? The report suggests it might not have been accidental." Lucy's eyes widened with pure disbelief, which quickly transformed into fury. "How dare you? My sister slipped on wet stairs coming home from work. She hit her head. She spent 3 days in the ICU before—" Her voice faltered, swallowed by emotion. "How can you even suggest something so monstrous?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Richard defended himself, though he was already beginning to feel ashamed for having listened to Diana's suspicions. "I just want to know all the facts." "The facts?" Lucy took a deep breath, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "How do you feel?" "The facts are that my sister was all I had in the world, until Michael came along. The facts are that I promised her, as she was dying, that her son would know his father. The facts are that, unlike what your fiancé seems to think, I have no interest in your money or your name." With trembling hands, she picked up the bottle again. "If you have so many doubts about me, maybe it's better if we leave tomorrow." That possibility hit Richard with surprising force. The idea of not seeing Michael every day, of not witnessing his growth, caused him unexpected pain. "No," he said quickly, "I don't want you to leave. It seems your fiancé would prefer otherwise." "My fiancé doesn't make decisions for me." Richard moved closer, risking gently touching Lucy's arm. "I'm sorry, it was unforgivable to question you like that." The sincerity in the apology made Lucy slightly soften her posture, though the hurt was still evident in her eyes. "I understand your suspicion," she finally said. "I appear out of nowhere with a baby, claiming he's your son. Anyone would have doubts. But I thought the DNA test had settled that question." "And it did," Richard assured her. "Regarding Michael, there is no doubt whatsoever. It's more about everything else." "What else do you want to know?" Richard hesitated. How could he explain that what troubled him most weren't the objective facts, but the way his own feelings were beginning to become confused and unpredictable? "I want to know you," he finally said. "Really, not just as Michael's aunt or Hannah's sister, but you, Lucy." The request, so simple and direct, caught her by surprise. For a moment she just stared at him, as if trying to assess the sincerity behind those words. "Why?" "Because if we're going to raise Michael together, even if separately, we need to trust each other, and to trust we need to know each other." Lucy nodded slowly. "All right. What do you want to know?" In the 2 hours that followed, while Michael slept peacefully in the portable crib they kept in the living room, Richard and Lucy talked with an honesty that neither was accustomed to. She spoke about her childhood in a middle-class family, about how she had always been the sensible one, while Hannah was the dreamer. She told him about losing her parents, about the period of depression, about how teaching had saved her, giving purpose to her days. Richard, in turn, revealed things he rarely shared. The lonely childhood as an only child of absent parents, the constant pressure to be perfect, the way he had built his empire at the expense of genuine relationships. "I never wanted children," he admitted at one point. "I always thought I'd be a terrible father, that I would repeat my parents' mistakes." "And now?" Lucy asked softly. "Now I'm afraid of not being present enough in Michael's life, of losing him even before I really get to know him." The vulnerability of that confession created something new between them, a type of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance, but with mutual understanding. "You won't lose him," Lucy assured. "Not if you really want to be part of his life." "I do," Richard affirmed with a conviction surprising even to himself. "More than I imagined possible." It was at this moment that the sound of heels in the corridor announced Diana's arrival. She stopped at the entrance to the living room, observing the domestic scene with calculating eyes. "Am I interrupting something important?" she asked, her tone falsely sweet. "We were just talking," Richard replied, standing up. "But it's late. I think we should all get some rest." Lucy also stood up, collecting the sleeping Michael. "Good night," she said simply, withdrawing with silent dignity. When they were alone, Diana abandoned the artificial smile. "I see my report didn't have the expected effect." "On the contrary," Richard replied coldly. "It had exactly the effect you didn't expect. It showed me what kind of person you really are. The kind of person who cares about you, who tries to protect you from opportunists. The kind who investigates innocent people, who distorts facts, who tries to manipulate others to get what they want." Richard faced her directly. "This ends here, Diana. Our relationship, our engagement, everything." The shock on her face quickly gave way to fury. "You can't be serious. You're going to throw away years of planning, the merger of our companies, everything because of this woman and her conveniently paternity-claimed baby. Michael is my son. Lucy is a woman of integrity who is raising my son with love and dedication." Richard kept his voice firm, though something inside him trembled with the magnitude of that moment. "And yes, I am willing to reconsider business agreements for them." "You'll regret this," Diana hissed. "My father won't accept this insult quietly. Your investors will know what kind of man you really are." "What kind would that be? A man who takes responsibility for his son, who values honesty above convenience." Richard took a step toward the door. "You can threaten all you want, Diana. My decision is made." After Diana's tempestuous exit, Richard remained in the living room for a long time, absorbing the consequences of what he had just done. Years of strategic planning, carefully cultivated business alliances, all put at risk by an emotional decision, and surprisingly, he didn't regret it. The next morning, news of the breakup had already spread through the city's business circles. Richard's phone didn't stop, ringing concerned advisors questioning partners, journalists sniffing out a scandal. He faced it all with the same calculated coolness that characterized him in business, refusing to give explanations beyond what was necessary. When he finally managed a moment of peace, he found Lucy in the garden, watching Michael playing on a colorful blanket. "I heard about the breakup," she said straightforwardly. "The house staff talks about nothing else." Richard nodded, sitting beside her on the grass. "It was inevitable." "Because of us?" "Because of many things," he answered honestly. "You were just the catalyst for a decision that had been brewing for some time." Lucy studied him for a moment before saying, "Still, I feel we've complicated your life." "You have, and simplified it at the same time." Richard smiled slightly, watching Michael trying to reach a colorful toy. "I never had much clarity about what really matters. Now I do." At that moment, Michael finally managed to grab the toy and emitted a little squeal of joy that made them both smile. It was a simple, pure sound, the sound of a small but significant victory for that little creature who was just beginning to discover the world. "About the proposal I made yesterday," Richard began carefully. About us getting married. It's no longer necessary, is it? Interrupted Lucy. Now that you've ended things with Diana, we can establish shared custody without additional complications. Richard observed her for a long moment before responding. What if I still wanted you to consider the proposal, not out of legal necessity, but out of choice? Lucy's eyes widened with genuine surprise. What? I'm not talking about romantic love, Richard quickly clarified. I'm talking about a partnership, about building something together, for Michael. A marriage of convenience, she summarized, her voice neutral. A marriage of purpose, he corrected, with clear terms, defined expectations. Lucy remained silent for several seconds, her eyes fixed on Michael, who was now happily babbling to his toy. Why would this be better than simply sharing custody each in our own home? She finally asked. The question was direct and logical, exactly the kind of questioning Richard appreciated. And yet, he found himself without a ready answer that wouldn't reveal more than he was prepared to admit. For Michael, it would mean growing up in a unified home, with both of us present daily, he finally answered. For us, it would mean a partnership in raising him, mutual support, shared resources. That sounds very practical, Lucy commented, a slight smile on her lips. Typical of you. It's who I am, Richard admitted. Practical to the bone. And if I accept, how long would this arrangement last? As long as we decide together. It could be until Michael reaches a certain age, or indefinitely, if it works well for everyone. Lucy looked back at Michael, who was now trying to put the toy in his mouth. I need to think, she finally said. It's too big a decision to make impulsively. Of course, Richard agreed. Take all the time you need. But before Lucy could respond, Richard's cell phone rang insistently. It was his lawyer with urgent news. Charles Vanderbilt, Diana's father, was threatening to cancel all contracts with Mitchell Enterprises and initiate a defamation campaign in business circles. The war had begun, and Richard knew it would be just the first of many attacks that would come in the days ahead. The storm unleashed by Charles Vanderbilt was relentless. In less than a week, Mitchell Enterprises' stocks plummeted, contracts were cancelled, and malicious rumors about Richard's personal life began to circulate in the city's business and social circles. He's determined to destroy you, explained Andrew Montgomery, Richard's longtime lawyer and friend, during an emergency meeting. He's using all his media and market contacts to undermine your credibility. Richard remained calm, analyzing the financial reports spread across the table. How long can we hold out? With current reserves? 3 months, maybe 4, Andrew hesitated. But there's a way out. If you reconsider the engagement with Diana. No. The response was immediate and definitive. We may lose contracts, money, even some companies, but I won't go back on this decision. The firmness of that refusal surprised even Andrew, who had known Richard for more than 2 decades. The man before him was not the same cold calculator who put business above everything. That same night, Richard found Lucy on the back porch watching the stars while Michael slept peacefully on the baby monitor beside her. Without a word, he sat in the chair next to her. Is it as bad as the newspapers say? She finally asked, breaking the silence. Worse, Richard admitted. Charles Vanderbilt is using all his influence to hurt me. Lucy studied him for a moment, the soft moonlight revealing lines of worry on his face that weren't there weeks before. Because of us, she stated, not as a question. Because of me, Richard corrected. Because of my choices. Choices you wouldn't have made if we weren't here. Richard considered that statement for a long moment. Maybe, or maybe you just showed me more clearly what I already knew deep down, that my life was built on misguided foundations. The silence that followed was filled only by the night sounds of the garden and Michael's soft breathing through the monitor. There was something peaceful about that moment, despite the crisis unfolding in their professional lives. I've decided to accept your proposal, Lucy suddenly said. Richard turned to face her, unsure if he had heard correctly. What? The marriage, she clarified. I accept your offer to marry you. Why? The question escaped before he could contain it. A small smile touched Lucy's lips. That's probably the least romantic reaction possible to an acceptance of a proposal. "I'm sorry," Richard quickly said. "It's just that after everything that's happening, I thought you would reconsider. It was exactly because of what's happening that I made my decision." Lucy leaned slightly toward him. "You're risking everything, your company, your reputation, your fortune, to honor your commitment to Michael. To both of us. That showed me what kind of man you really are." The simplicity of that explanation touched something deep inside Richard. All his life, he had been judged by his material successes, by his power, by his ability to win at any cost. Never by his character, by his moral choices. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Vanderbilt is just getting started. Things might get much worse before they get better." "I've faced difficulties before," Lucy replied with that serenity that impressed him so much, "and this time, I'm not alone." A week later, they married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, with only Andrew and Martha, the mansion's housekeeper, as witnesses. There was no party, white dress, or newspaper announcements, just two adults making a legal commitment before a justice of the peace, while a sleeping baby rested in the housekeeper's arms. When the judge pronounced the final words and declared them husband and wife, there was a moment of hesitation. The protocol required a kiss, but both were conscious of the nature of their arrangement. It was Richard who finally took the initiative, leaning in to place a soft kiss on Lucy's lips. Brief, respectful, but strangely laden with an unspoken promise. "Welcome to the Mitchell family officially," he said when they pulled apart, a slight smile on his lips. The press reaction was exactly as they expected. Sensationalist headlines, speculation about the lightning marriage, and malicious insinuations about Lucy's motives. Charles Vanderbilt intensified his attacks, now directing part of his fury also at the opportunistic teacher who had deceived the powerful businessman. Against all expectations, it was this extension of the attacks that ended up reversing the situation. When journalists began to harass the school where Lucy worked, interviewing colleagues and even parents of students, the narrative began to change. Stories emerged about the dedicated special education teacher who worked overtime without pay, who used her own resources to buy materials for her students, who had been voted Educator of the Year for 2 consecutive years. Public opinion, initially influenced by Vanderbilt's powerful contacts, began to question the official version. What opportunist would continue working as a teacher after marrying one of the richest men in the country? What scammer would dedicate her professional life to children with special needs? In a brilliant strategic move, Andrew suggested that Richard and Lucy give a single exclusive interview, carefully choosing a journalist known for her integrity. The article, published in a nationally circulated magazine, presented not the story of a deceived tycoon or a successful opportunist, but of two people united by tragic circumstances, trying to do the best for an innocent child. The photograph accompanying the report, Richard, Lucy, and Michael sitting unpretentiously in the mansion's garden, captured something that no public relations manipulation could forge: the image of a real, imperfect family trying to find its way. The tide began to turn. Business partners who had distanced themselves discreetly returned. Mitchell Enterprises stocks stabilized, and when an investigative journalist discovered that Charles Vanderbilt had falsified documents in a recent international acquisition, the tables were turned. In a matter of weeks, it was the Vanderbilt family facing public scrutiny and official investigations. Amid this gradual professional recovery, Richard and Lucy's domestic life settled into a comfortable, though unusual, routine. They shared the same house, but occupied separate suites. They dined together every night, discussing the day's events and sharing Michael's progress. On weekends, they began taking small outings, to the park, to the beach, to places where they could provide Michael with normal experiences, away from the media spotlight. It was during one of these outings, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, at the City Park, that something unexpected happened. Michael, who had recently begun crawling with agility, moved a few yards away chasing a butterfly. When he stumbled and fell, His immediate cry made both Richard and Lucy run to him. They arrived, at the same time kneeling beside the baby. While Lucy picked him up, Richard gently examined the small scraped knee. Their eyes met over the child's head, a moment of silent connection, of shared concern, of mutual responsibility. And then, without planning or anticipating it, Richard leaned in and kissed Lucy. It wasn't a protocol kiss like at the wedding ceremony, but something genuine, born not of obligation or arrangement, but of a feeling that had been silently growing between them. When they pulled apart, both seemed equally surprised. Michael, already recovered from his small accident, was pulling at his father's shirt, completely oblivious to the significant moment he had just witnessed. "I'm sorry," Richard murmured. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Lucy interrupted, a soft redness coloring her cheeks. "Don't apologize." The journey back home was made in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people processing a fundamental change in their relationship, the discovery that what had begun as a practical arrangement had, without them realizing it, transformed into something deeper. That night, after putting Michael to bed, they sat on the porch as they had done so many other times, but there was a palpable difference in the air between them. "Our agreement," Richard began carefully, "was based on specific premises." "Yes," Lucy agreed, "a marriage of convenience for Michael's sake." "And if—" he hesitated, searching for the right words. "And if it were no longer just for convenience?" Lucy studied him for a long moment before answering. "Are you suggesting that our arrangement has transformed into something more?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it was always more than we admitted." Richard moved closer, gently touching her hand. "I'm a man of numbers, of contracts, of certainties. My entire life was built on calculated decisions until you and Michael arrived. And now? Now I find myself making choices based not on logic or advantage, but on feelings." The word came out with evident effort. "Feelings for both of you." "Are you saying that—" "I'm saying that maybe we did things in the wrong order." Richard smiled slightly. "We got married, we share a home, we're raising a child together, and only now am I realizing that I fell in love with you along the way." The confession hung between them, vulnerable and honest in a way Richard rarely allowed himself to be. Lucy remained silent for several seconds, her face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. "When Hannah died," she finally said, "I thought my heart had closed forever, except for Michael. I never imagined I could feel this again." She intertwined her fingers with his, "But it happened anyway, without planning, without expecting it." "And now?" Richard asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What do we do?" Lucy smiled, that tranquil smile that had always impressed him since the first day. "Now, we continue building our family. One day at a time, but perhaps—" She slowly moved closer, perhaps with fewer separate sweets and more moments like this. The kiss they shared then was different from all the previous ones, without hesitation, without surprise, just the quiet certainty of two hearts that had found their way to each other through the most unlikely circumstances. 6 months later, as Mitchell Enterprises regained its stability and the Vanderbilt family faced legal proceedings for corporate fraud, Richard made a decision that surprised the financial market. He sold his mansion and various luxury properties, using part of the resources to establish a foundation dedicated to special education, a project that Lucy would assume as director. With the rest, he acquired a seaside property where, following designs found in a notebook that had belonged to Hannah, they began to build not just a new home, but also a small boutique hotel. The unrealized dream of the woman who had, indirectly, brought them all together. On the afternoon they visited the property for the first time as owners. Michael, who was now taking his first hesitant steps, ran awkwardly through the sand, his clear laughter echoing in the salty air. Richard and Lucy watched, hands intertwined, the promise of a future that neither could have imagined a year before. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if she were still here?" Richard softly questioned. "If Hannah could see all this?" Lucy contemplated the horizon for a moment. "I believe she knows," she responded with serenity, "and I think she's happy. Not just because Michael found his father, but because, in some strange and wonderful way, we all found exactly what we needed." As the sun set over the ocean, illuminating the three of them with its golden light, Richard understood a truth that all his years of business success hadn't taught him: that families, like companies, can arise from the most unpredictable circumstances, that bonds, like contracts, can begin for convenience but flourish into something profoundly more meaningful, and that sometimes the greatest risk of all, opening one's heart, brings the most valuable return. That night, when they finally put Michael to sleep in his new room, decorated with stars that glowed on the dark ceiling, Richard and Lucy sealed their love not with papers or formal promises, but with the silent certainty of those who have discovered through losses and gains the true meaning of family. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Richard, Lucy, and little Michael has touched your hearts. To continue exploring stories that remind us of the transformative power of love and family, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives. Find it by clicking on the link on the left side of the screen. If this story awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Daily, we share new stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the unexpected paths that destiny presents us. Tell us in the comments if you've ever lived or witnessed a situation where the unexpected transformed into the greatest blessing. Your stories also deserve to be heard, and we eagerly await getting to know them. Until our next meeting.